Well, good morning, everyone. If you're visiting or you haven't been for a while, you're particularly welcome with us. I hope that you've sensed God's presence as we've been worshipping together. Thank you, Tim and Worship Group, for leading us so sensitively. It was a very special time. In recent weeks, we have been journeying together through Joshua, and this morning we've reached chapter 8. So far, if you've been with us, you will know that it's been a journey of ups and downs for the Israelites and their leader, Joshua. So a bit like the mountaintop and the valley experiences that we've been singing about in the Highland song, or indeed that many, if not all of us, will relate to in our own lives. Chapter 6 is probably the best known story in this book, that high point of the sound of the trumpets in victory, when the walls of Jericho fell down. However, if you were with us a couple of weeks ago, you will know that straight after that, in chapter 7, was the lowest point of Joshua's leadership so far, when they were humiliated in defeat at Ai. And you may remember that Neil preached on that and taught us about that a couple of weeks back. So this morning we're going to pick up first the beginning of chapter 8 to find out what happened next. So let's read together. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Do not be afraid, do not be discouraged. Take the whole army with you and go up and attack Ai. For I have delivered into your hands the king of Ai, his people, his city, and his land. You shall do to Ai and its king as you did to Jericho and its king, except that you may carry off their plunder and livestock for yourselves. Set an ambush to the city." So Joshua and the whole army moved out to attack Ai. He chose 30,000 of his best fighting men and sent them out at night with these orders. "Listen carefully. You are to set an ambush behind the city. Don't go very far from it. All of you, be on the alert. I and all those with me will advance on the city, and when the men come out against us, as they did before, we will flee from them. They will pursue us until we have lured them away from the city, for they will say, 'They are running away from us as they did before.' So when we flee from them, you are to rise up from ambush and take the city. The Lord your God will give it into your hand. When you have taken the city, set it on fire. Do what the Lord has commanded. See to it. You have my orders." Then Joshua sent them off, and they went to the place of ambush and lay in wait between Bethel and Ai, to the west of Ai. But Joshua spent the night with the people. And then the passage continues to tell us how they went to battle and how that went, which was exactly how Joshua had planned it. Verse 10, early the next morning, Joshua mustered his army, and he and the leaders of Israel marched before them to Ai. By verse 19, we're not going to read all of it this morning, but they entered the city and captured it. And then this section ends with the king. He has now been killed and buried at the city gate. So verse 29, at the entrance of the city gate, they raised a large pile of rocks over it, which remains to this day. We will return to the rest of this passage a little bit later. Chapter 8, it's a long passage with lots going on. So I've tried to simplify it to help myself understand it at least. And I've got 5 lessons that I want us to think about together for a short time. And just to help me, they all begin with the same letter. And this week, that letter is P. So the first lesson is that we can learn, I think, is that there is the possibility of second chances with God. After that first disastrous attempt, when they experienced defeat and lost 37 men, plus Achan and his family, of course, due to Achan's lies and disobedience, the Lord didn't hand Joshua his P45 form and give up on him. Rather, God's covenant plan was still the plan. So the Lord in his faithfulness persisted and patiently had a follow-up conversation with Joshua, giving him that new opportunity that we've read about to go and try again. I wonder, did you notice the first thing that the Lord said to Joshua? He said, Joshua, do not be afraid and do not be discouraged. In other words, he was saying, I see your uncertainty and your fears, your disappointment. So Joshua, let me first encourage you. This is a new day. And of course, it was going to be different. If we remember back to the start of chapter 1, God told Joshua 3 times to be strong and courageous. Why? Because God was with him and his people. I am sure that all of us can relate to that D word, the D for disappointment. And its accompanying whirlwind of emotions: shock, anger, uncertainty about the future, disappointment in how things have worked out or haven't worked out, disappointment how others have let us down. Maybe our disappointment today is in God, or in the past has been in God. Those delays, the doors that haven't opened, no matter how hard we've prayed, or they haven't opened yet, and we've been waiting a long time. Maybe for me sometimes, the most difficult disappointment to process is disappointment in myself when I have messed up and caused consequences not only for me, but for other people too sometimes. So if by now it's feeling a little bit hot and you're getting a little bit drowsy, if you forget everything else that I'm going to say from this point on, please remember this, that thankfully, God hasn't given up on any of us, on me or on you, just as he hadn't given up on Joshua. These are days for us to move forward with God's help, days of opportunity. So we don't need to stay stuck with that sense of failure or with our disappointments. Before we finish today, I want to circle back to this point, because I think that the principles that Joshua applied in round 2 of the battle with Ai, those things that he had learned about himself and about God, the Lord, in round 1, as we had recorded in chapter 7, they can help us too. So for now, let's move on to my second P, which reminds us that the promise from God preceded the victory. And this is lovely. This is so special, so amazing. And this is just exactly the same as it was in the Battle of Jericho in chapter 6. In verse 1, the Lord said to Joshua, I have delivered all of Ai. This part, it's written in the past tense because the Lord had already planned the outcome and the victory. And knowing this should have helped Joshua to feel a little bit more courageous, of course. And plus, of course, at the beginning of the passage, there was also the reward this time. They were allowed to keep the plunder. So one can't help thinking about poor Achan. If only he, in chapter 7, hadn't got ahead of God, he could have had so much more than what he took and hid in his tent. Do you remember the Babylonian robe and the bit of gold and silver? So, what about us? We've been singing how we are recipients of God's grace and mercy because Jesus paid the price for us on Calvary. So thankfully, we don't need these blood sacrifices like the Old Testament laws required. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 57 says, Thanks be to God, he gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. That victory that's not in or of anything that we can accomplish on our own, coming only through Jesus, who can conquer death and sin and darkness. And of course, we look forward in hope to that day when he will return and all things will be made new. There'll be no more disappointment then. Our third P this morning is that Joshua's preparations started in prayer. Back in chapter 7, we heard how Joshua reached out to God. The section, verses 6 to 9, it tells us that after the first defeat, Joshua reacted in grief and mourning. He was tearing his clothes, falling on his face before God, questioning how God could have allowed his people to be defeated. And he was also concerned about the shame that the defeat had brought on God's name in all of the surrounding nations in the promised land. Joshua's prayer wasn't a perfect prayer of trust, but he was honest as he poured out his heart, and the Lord heard. As a result, Joshua was renewed and energized from this time of conversation and lament, and he gained the strength he needed. It's not easy to start over again for any of us, is it? But in Psalm 34, verse 18, we are reminded that the Lord is close. He's always close, isn't he? But close to the brokenhearted, to the disappointed. Paul, writing to the church at Corinth in 2 Corinthians 4, verses 8 and 9, reminded them in the midst of their hardship and persecution that although they were afflicted in every way, they were not crushed. They were perplexed, but they were not driven to despair. They were persecuted, but not forsaken. Struck down, but not destroyed. And it continues to tell us a bit later from verse 16, therefore, they would not lose heart. They would fix their eyes not on what was seen and on what was going on around them, but on what was unseen. For what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. We need to hold on to that verse, that truth, in the most difficult times that we go through, those valley experiences. Our prayers are never wasted. We need to lean into God and remember that God hears us and that he sees the bigger picture, even when we can't. So back to Joshua's preparations. He did a lot of practical, strategic planning as well. He used what he'd learned first time round. This time, he was more intentional and hands-on in his approach. Any previous overconfidence and self-reliance that had contributed to the earlier defeat was replaced by God dependence and a focus on wholehearted obedience. He took the enemy this time more seriously, and he developed a battle plan involving 30,000 warriors. Last time, if you remember, he sent in only 3,000. Now, there were only 12,000 people in AE, but Joshua wasn't taking any chances. Importantly as well, he told the community of God's chosen people that God would do it, so they just needed to obey. Verses 7 and 8, the Lord your God will give it into your hand. Do what the Lord has commanded. See to it you have my orders. Joshua developed the battle plan that we read together, and the ambush from the valley in the west was key to the victory. So the Lord told Joshua generally what to do, but he left the detail and the planning to Joshua, who was a great military leader, for him to use his skills in the planning. I will leave it to you in your life group to explore more of the detail of the battle. But for now, what can we learn from Joshua's approach to planning? Sometimes I can be tempted to think that planning is a little bit tedious and a little bit of a waste of my time. I might rather be doing something else. But I couldn't be more wrong. Times of preparation are so important, and we honour God when we are careful and diligent in these times. God is always doing something new, isn't he? So we need to be alert and listening, watching and waiting in expectation, rather than just going along in autopilot, thinking what we always did is what will happen again. And those spiritual disciplines are so important. We need to put on the full armour of God and remember that we are in a battle. There's an old saying that says, if the devil can't make you sin, then he'll make you busy. And sometimes I remind myself of that. We need to remember that with God, nothing is wasted. A number of times recently in this sermon series, we have come back to the truth that God's ways and timing are always different from what we would choose or would make immediate sense to us. But in the words of Isaiah 55, verses 8 and 9, the Lord says, "My thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." The fourth principle that we can learn is that partnership together enabled the Lord's plan. The people's unity and obedience to the Lord and Joshua was required. What Yahweh had declared needed to be made a reality through an obedient Israel. So most importantly, they were all partnering with God in his covenant plan. As we read in verse 7, the Lord your God will give it into your hand. And this verse is sitting alongside verse 1, where we know that the Lord had already ordained the victory. Joshua's leadership approach was also key, supporting his warriors. Like in verse 9, when we read that he slept out in the valley overnight to be with his men and encourage and support them. I think it can't have been easy for all of those warriors to go back into battle in Ai. Some of the soldiers must have had flashbacks to that previous disastrous defeat. But their peer support helped to pull them through, even in the worst moments, and no one deviated from what Joshua had instructed. So much better than the first time. They all trusted that what Joshua said from the Lord would come true and was right. And they persevered until the mission was accomplished. Working together in unity makes obedience to any task easier, doesn't it? This has been a recurring theme for us lately, and I really do think that it's a word in season. We had the great preaching last week from Ephesians chapter 4, which was all about working together in unity, maintaining our unity, celebrating one another's different gifts. And Philippians 2, verse 2 reminds us that the Lord delights in unity among his people who have the same love, being of one accord and of one mind. We want more of that as we work together with our Pastor Neil in this new season, and we seek to move forward, knowing that it's the Lord's work. The Lord is in control, and that as we want to faithfully move forward in obedience, taking the right opportunities as they open up to us. Let's now move to the final part of this passage. Verse 30 to the end describes how the covenant was renewed at Mount Ebal. So let's read that part together. This is like an add-on to the battle story. Then Joshua built on Mount Ebal an altar to the Lord, the God of Israel, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded the Israelites. He built it according to what is written in the book of the law of Moses, an altar of uncut stones on which no iron tool had been used. On it they offered to the Lord burnt offerings and sacrificed fellowship offerings. There, in the presence of the Israelites, Joshua wrote on stones a copy of the law of Moses. All the Israelites, with their elders, officials, and and judges were standing on both sides of the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, facing the Levitical priests who carried it. Both the foreigners living among them and the native-born were there. Half of the people stood in front of Mount Gerizim, and half of them in front of Mount Ebal, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had formerly commanded when he gave instructions to bless the people of Israel. Afterward, Joshua read all the words of the law, the blessings and the curses, just as it is written in the book of the law. There was not a word of all that Moses had commanded that Joshua did not read to the whole assembly of Israel, including the women and children and the foreigners who lived among them. So my final P is for proclamation of the law and renewal in response. The people's response to the victories that the Lord had given them in the promised land was to make this special time to worship as a community together. It was also an opportunity for renewal of their commitment to the law. Now, this part of the account has cut away from the battles, and we've moved 20 miles north to Mount Ebal. And in this account, Joshua is obeying the instructions from Moses that we can read about in Deuteronomy chapter 27. So if you want something to do this afternoon, I recommend you reread Joshua 8 and also have a look at Deuteronomy 27. We read about the altar in verse 30, and that reminds us that worship was to be at the heart of Israel's life. Their burnt offerings were to atone for their sin, and the fellowship or the peace offerings were to reaffirm their relationship both with God and the community. We might think of something similar when we take the Lord's Supper together. We are told that all of God's community gathered. I think that's an amazing picture. This is something that Martin focused on a few weeks back when we were thinking about the Battle of Jericho, including all those that had turned to the Lord, like Rahab and her family. And somehow there were approximately 2 million people. And we are told that they gathered in the valley of Shechem. They put the Ark of the Covenant in the middle. And then all of these people, they spread up the 2 mountains on either side, Mount Gerizim and Mount Gerizim and Edal. And they read the law aloud. It must have been such an amazing picture of fellowship and proclaiming the law. In verse 32, we find out more about the law. We're told that Joshua wrote the law of Moses on the stones. And then he read it all to the people. Joshua 1, verse 8. The Lord gives the instruction to Joshua at the same time as he's telling him to be strong and courageous, to keep this book of the law always on his lips, to meditate on it day and night, to be careful to do everything that was written in it. Because this was part of God's plan. This was the way that prosperity and success would follow. What about us? How do we respond when things go well? Do we always remember to make time, to take time for worship and consecration, to thank God, draw closer to him? That time for renewal. Also, do we desire to keep the scriptures on our lips? Reading it, not only skimming it, but trying to understand it so we can put it into practice. And that's not always easy. It takes time and discipline. The other thing that I find interesting is that it tells us that Joshua did not leave out any part of the law when he read it to the people. Now, some of them would not have been able to read, so he was reading to them. But it challenges me to ask myself, I wonder sometimes, do I pick and choose the bit of God's word that I find easier or that perhaps will encourage me, and leave some of the more difficult passages out. When Alice was opening our service this morning, she made reference to that well-known verse in Matthew 4, verse 4, where Jesus replied with the instruction, "Man, or we shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." His word, as she said, it feeds and nourishes us, as well as at other times rebuking and correcting and helping us when we let it. You see, I think we have to agree, don't we, that knowing is not enough. We need to move to action, as Joshua and the people did. An example of moving into action for us this morning might be in the area of evangelism. You know, we have that assurance that the Holy Spirit is with us, will enable us to witness, but we only discover the power that His Spirit gives us when we consciously engage in the acts and we do it. As we prepare to finish this morning, let me take us back to where I started. Because this is a passage that tells us how Joshua had the opportunity to hit the reset button. And by that I mean God gave him a new opportunity to reflect on the past, to enter into God's nearer presence through prayer, to muster support from others, to embrace the moment of new opportunity, and most importantly, to follow through by trusting and obeying God's plan. And we have the same opportunity today, because He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He's a God of not only second chances, but in my case, third and fourth and fifth chances as well, who never gives up on us, but rather is cheering us on in love and encouragement. Our past mistakes never, ever disqualify us. In the words of Henry Ford, who developed cars, of course, mistakes are an opportunity to start again more intelligently. Sometimes I think that we need to hit the reset button. Those times when I am filled with fear. Or maybe this morning, some of us feel stuck in a situation and we're really wary and struggling to try again. Or maybe you're struggling to accept or forgive yourself, even though you know that others have moved on. God sees you, and today, in this time together, He hears each of our hearts, just as He heard Joshua's heart. I love the verse in Isaiah 49, verse 16, that says, "Look, I have inscribed your name on the palm of my hands." You see, we each matter to Him. He's got a lot to do in a busy world, but He is God. He is always able to see you in the palm of His hand, even when you struggle or I struggle to see His hand in your situation. Prayer is so often where peace begins and grows, and then we can get our worries into a better perspective and look up, remembering that those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength, as it says in Isaiah 40, verse 31. We used to sing a song with the words, "That same power that conquered the grave lives in me." So all the strength that we need comes from Him. Faith always requires a risk, but hope lights our path one step at a time. In front of me, we've got the candle of hope. Hebrews 10, verse 23 says, "Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering." Why? Because He who has promised is faithful. Not just was faithful back then, but always will be, is faithful. We have the armour of God to help us stay strong and alert. And the final book of the Bible, Revelation, in chapter 14, verse 12, indicates that such a battle calls for patient endurance on the part of the people of God who keep his commands and remain faithful to Jesus. Working together in unity helps us persevere and stay the journey, helps us remain accountable with being God-dependent, rather than drifting back into any self-reliance. And finally, all that our futures hold is by his grace. I came across a quote that said, "You didn't survive because you were strong. You survived because God was faithful. Your story is still moving forward, not because you never fell, but because grace refused to leave you there." And I trust that these words will help each one of us. If you're struggling today and you would like to talk some more, or for someone to pray with you, please just come and have a chat with me or someone else who you know and trust.